In this episode, we begin a two-part exploration of the Menagerie, starting with part 1.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of trekking through compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 11, The Menagerie, Stardate 3012.4. The Menagerie, Stardate 3012.4. This episode and its sequel were derived from the original pilot for the Star Trek series, The Cage. The Enterprise diverts to Starbase 11 after Spock reports receiving a subspace message from the former captain of the Enterprise, Christopher Pike. However, the Commodore on the Starbase tells him Pike has been injured from exposure to delta rays and could not have sent the message. This is confirmed when Kirk and Spock are shown that Pike is confined to a wheelchair, which is operated by brainwaves. The only communication of which Pike is capable is signaling yes and no. Pike refuses to speak to Bones or Kirk, but agrees to speak to Spock in private. Spock, who had served under Pike for 11 years, prepares to mutiny in order to take him to Talos 11, despite his protest. Meanwhile, an investigation of tapes reveals that Spock received no such transmission, but Kirk refuses to believe it is possible that Spock could have been responsible for the deception. Spock commandeers Pike. They go aboard the Enterprise. The Enterprise warps out. Kirk and Mendez pursue Spock, and the Enterprise stops and beams Kirk and Mendez aboard just as their shuttlecraft is about to run out of fuel. Spock informs them that he has set up the ship's computer so that it cannot be disengaged without terminating life support until the Enterprise reaches Talos 4. Spock is then put on trial. Not only is it a mutiny, which is a court-martial offense, but visiting Talos 4 is an offense punishable by death. The hearing proceeds because Pike is still listed on active duty, so 3 command officers, as required by regulations, are present. During the hearing, Spock introduces a recording of the experiences of the original crew of the Enterprise on Talos 4. The tape recounts how 13 years previously, the Enterprise, commanded by Pike, received a distress signal from the survey vessel Columbia, which had been lost some 18 years earlier. Unbeknownst to the landing party, their actions were being monitored by the native Talosians. The Doctor notices that the condition of the survivors is better than could have been reasonably expected and becomes suspicious. Before he can find out what's going on, Vina leads Pike into a Talosian trap. As soon as Pike is drugged and captured by the Talosians, the survivors, who were all illusionary, vanish. In a desperate attempt to rescue Pike, the landing party tries to blast through the rock to which Pike was spirited away, but their phasers have apparently no effect. At this juncture, Uhura pipes in to report that the Enterprise has been receiving transmissions directly from Talos 4, and Kirk has been relieved of duty by order of Starfleet Command, and Commodore Mendez is ordered to take control of the Enterprise. That's the end of part 1. So, fun fact, Robert Justman convinced Gene Roddenberry to write a 2-part series utilizing the first pilot because they ran out of scripts in the middle of the season and would have had to have shut down production otherwise. So, sometimes cost cutting can lead to great series. The Menagerie Parts 1 and 2 are certainly 2 of the most unique episodes in all of Star Trek, the original series. Of course, this is largely because we had a different crew, and the pilot for this series was this episode, although it was expanded into a 2-parter during the first year of the original series. But we meet Captain Pike, Number 1, Majel Barrett, who of course later appears as Nurse Chapel, and others. In fact, the only crewman from both this series, or rather these 2 episodes, The Menagerie Parts 1 and 2, and the original series, is Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock. So that makes it interesting. But it also has some great science fiction with mind control by the Telosians, starting with the wreck, what appears to be a wreck of ancient scientists, and how they might look if they lived 20 years, basically with all men and one girl or one woman, and how she might relate to people if she'd only been around engineers. But the science fiction part and the mind control part really pales beside the human spirit. And that's the thing that really drives this episode, or 2 episodes, as we'll see in the conclusion in part 2, is the human drive not to be enslaved. I find that particularly insightful now because of the human slavery issues literally across the globe, from the Uyghurs in China to children in the sex trade in the Far East and everything in between. So our role in compliance is to fight human slavery in the corporate world. And this, of course, means looking at who's in your supply chain all the way down, finding out if any of the vendors you're using are in locations or industries that have tended to favor slave labor in the past. Should give you extra pause because the risk is greater. So interesting storyline here, some great science fiction. Obviously, if you love Star Trek, the chance to meet Captain Christopher Pike is something you don't want to pass up. It shows Gene Roddenberry at the start of the formulation of the stories that become the canon of Star Trek, and that's something also really to be celebrated. So I hope you'll check out the Menagerie, this part 1, and of course part 2, which we'll take up in our next episode. Today we're going to take up some of the ethical lessons from the Menagerie. Tomorrow we're going to take up some of the compliance lessons. But there's some important ethical lessons I think are worth highlighting. Number 1, informed consent and autonomy. This episode revolves around the discovery that Captain Pike, a former Enterprise captain, is being held against his will in a controlled environment. This raises concerns about informed consent and the right to personal autonomy. Compliance programs should ensure that organizations respect individual autonomy and obtain freely given informed consent, especially when it comes to sensitive matters involving vulnerable individuals. Number 2, disability and accessibility. Captain Pike's disability and the accommodations, or lack thereof, provided to him in the Telosian Preserve underscore the importance of disability rights and accessibility. Compliance programs should address the fair treatment of individuals with disabilities and ensure that organizations make reasonable accommodations to support their participation and inclusion. Number 3, deception and manipulation. The Telosians' use of illusion and mind control to manipulate the Enterprise crew and Captain Pike both highlight the ethical risks associated with the deception and manipulation. Compliance frameworks should emphasize truthfulness, transparency, and the avoidance of exploitive practices, even in the pursuit of perceived greater good objectives. Number 4, conflicting duties and obligations. This episode presents a dilemma where the crew of the Enterprise must balance their duty to rescue Captain Pike with their obligations to obey Starfleet orders and maintain the Prime Directive. The compliance program should address how to navigate ethical conflicts and provide guidance on resolving competing duties and responsibilities. Number 5, experimentation and the treatment of sentient beings. The Telosians' treatment of Captain Pike and the Enterprise crew as subjects for their experiments raises concerns about the ethical considerations surrounding experimentation on sentient beings. Compliance programs should establish clear ethical guidelines for any activities involving the research, testing, and treatment of individuals as subjects. Indeed, there are compliance professionals specializing in pharmaceutical trials testing, and I think this would also hold true in experimentation and treatment of sentient beings. And number 6, whistleblowing and moral courage. This episode features a character Mr. Spock, who risks his career to reveal the truth about Captain Pike's situation. This highlights the importance of whistleblowing and moral courage within a compliance framework, as individuals may need to challenge the status quo to uphold ethical principles. By learning the ethical lessons in the Menagerie, both parts 1 and 2, compliance professionals can help organizations strengthen their policies around informed consent, disability rights, truthfulness, ethical decision-making, and the protection of vulnerable individuals, ultimately fostering a more ethically grounded compliance culture. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow where we take up part 2 of the Menagerie.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.